All right, guys, so what we have right now is a complete client-side application. All of our feedback items are just hard-coded and being displayed in the browser. We're not actually storing them anywhere aside from memory. Now, we can add, update, and delete from the UI, from the user interface, but that's it. And that's what React does. It's a UI library or a front-end framework. In many cases, though, your React application will work with some kind of API, some kind of backend. So we're actually going to use something called JSON-Server, which acts as our own backend API. That way we can make requests to it and get responses back. And I'll explain more about JSON-Server in the next video, but I just want to quickly go over some of the basics of HTTP requests and just how a full stack application works in general. So first of all, the data itself is usually stored in some kind of database on a server. This could be MySQL or Postgres, MongoDB. All of those are examples of databases. Then when you build some kind of backend API, that API will interact with the database and be able to get data and add data and so on. And when it fetches data, it will typically return it as JSON. So this API could be written in just about any language. It could be Node.js, which is JavaScript. It could be Python, PHP, C#, or any other language. And you typically use a backend framework like Express, Django, Laravel. There's all types of frameworks for just about every language. Now, when you create this API, you'll have some kind of endpoints or special URLs that we can hit with specific HTTP methods from the client. And we do this from our React application. And there's different ways you can do it. You can use the Fetch API, which is built into the browser, or you could use an HTTP client, something like Axios. Now, we fetch the data and we bring it into our React application. And since we're using the Context API to manage our state, we're going to make the request from there and put the data into our global state, okay? All the feedback items. And then it gets handed down to the components that need it. And we've already set this up. We already have basically the infrastructure to do that. We just need to make the request to the back end and create our back end, of course. Now, usually our backend API will be what's called a REST API, and REST stands for Representational State Transfer, and is a specific architecture style that we use for client-server communication. And when we make requests to the client from the to the server from the client, we use specific HTTP methods for certain tasks. So, for example, a GET request is typically used to retrieve data from the server. Even if you use a browser and you go to a web page, that's going to be a GET request. A POST request is used to submit new data to the server. So if you submit a form, or you can just send JSON data directly. A put or a patch request is usually used to update data on the server, and then a delete request, of course, deletes data. Now, we also have a specific URL structure that we use with REST APIs. Since we're using feedback items, that's what we have for data, we might have these URLs or these endpoints right here. So a GET request to /feedback would just return all of our feedback items. A GET request to feedback /1 represents the specific ID for the feedback item that we want. And of course, this could be anything. I'm just using one as an example. A POST request to feedback, you would send data along with it, and that would typically add to the server or add to the database through the API. A put request to feedback1 would update the feedback item with the ID of 1, and then a delete request to feedback1 would delete that feedback with the ID of 1. So you can have the same endpoints, same URLs, they're just different methods that are used. And basically the mock REST API or the mock backend that we're using, JSON-Server, already has this structure in place. So what's nice is if you want to replace it with your own backend that you write with whatever, Node and Express or Python Django, you can simply create these endpoints as through your backend, and you can use that instead of JSON-Server. Now, the last thing I want to talk about in this video is HTTP status codes. Because when you make a request to a server, you get back a status code, and that basically lets you know what kind of response you're getting. So I just want to go over these real quick. The 1XX, basically the 100 range, is informational, and that typically just means everything is okay so far, but we haven't gotten a response yet. If we get a 200 response, that means success. It means that it was successfully received. Everything went as it should. Now there's a range. 200 just is a basic success, but we also have 201, for instance, which means that everything went okay and something was also created. So often when you submit a form and make a post request and you add something, in our case a feedback item, you'll typically get back a 201 response. The 300 range is redirect, so it usually indicates that the request has more than one possible responses. We don't deal with that too much. The 400 response is a client error. So a good example of this is if you make a post request and you send in a form and you're missing the email field and the email field is required, you'll get back a 400 response. That's the client's error. The fault happened on the client. A 404 is an example of a not found error. If you try to access something that doesn't exist, you'll get back a 404. And then the 500 series is a server error, meaning whatever went wrong happened on the server. And that could be anything, some kind of code that just isn't right on the server. So that's an overall view of how a client server or a full stack application works, in addition to HTTP methods and status codes. So now let's move on and let's start to do some of this stuff by creating a mock REST API using JSON-Server. All right, so now we're going to install JSON-Server, which is going to act as our backend. It's basically a mock backend. And typically you'd have some kind of backend API that serves JSON data, and that could be written in anything. It could be Node.js with a framework like Express. It could be Python, C#, PHP, anything really, as long as it serves JSON data. That's the typical standard these days. So JSON-Server will just act as our backend, and basically the way it works is we create a JSON file, and that works like an API with a database. We can, if we go to routes here, we can make GET requests to fetch our data. In this case, they're using posts as an example. So this would get all posts. This would get the post with the ID of 1. If we make a post request, that would create a new post. Put and patcher for updating specific posts. In our case, it'll be feedback items, but they're using posts. And then we can make a delete request as well. And it'll actually add, update, and delete from the file as if it were a real database, which is really cool. There's also filtering. We can filter our results. We can sort. There's all types of things we can do. So this JSON-Server package is awesome, and I've used it for years. So we just want to install it with NPM. We're not going to install it globally. We're going to install it locally. So let's open up our VS Code, and I've cut off the server for now. You can see localhost 3000 isn't working. And we're just going to npm install JSON-Server. And next thing we want to do is add a script to our package.json, because we need a way to run JSON-Server. So we have our scripts here. I'm going to go ahead and add to this. So I'm going to call this server. I mean, you could call it whatever you want, JSON, server, whatever. I'm going to call it server, and we're going to have it run JSON-Server, and then we want to do --watch. Now here's where we put the name of the file, the JSON file that we wanted to watch, which we haven't created yet, but I'm going to call it db.json. So let's add that. And then I also want this, I think it runs on port 3000 by default, and that's the port that our React dev server runs on, so we want to change that. So I'm going to do --port and then 5000. Okay, so we'll go ahead and save that. Now we have to create this db.json file. So let's go in here, and we're going to put this, this is going to go right in the root here. Don't put it in your source folder. It's going to go right here, db.json. And then this is where we want to put our data. So this is basically like a mock database, and it has to be JSON. So what we'll do is open up some curly braces here, and then you can have different, I guess they would be schemas, or I mean, you could even look at them as like tables. We just need one, and that's for our feedback. So we're going to call this feedback, and then we're going to set that to an array. And I'm just going to put a couple objects in here, and we're going to have the same fields. It's going to be the ID, the rating, and the text. So since it's JSON, we do have to wrap our keys in double quotes. So let's say ID. So we'll do ID1, and then let's add a rating. So for rating, we'll do 10, and then let's put our text. So text, I'm just going to say this is, we'll say this is feedback item 1 coming from the backend, just so we know, because we're going to hook to this and have this as our default data. And I just want to just display that it's coming from the backend. So I'm going to copy this object right here, and I'm going to add another one. Let's put a comma here. We'll do 3. Okay, so the second one here, let's make this ID 2. We'll make the rating 8, and let's just say this is feedback item 2 coming from the back end. This one here, let's give it an ID of 3, and we'll give this a rating of 8, and we'll say this is feedback item 3. And what's really cool is when we make a post request and we add something to, if we add a feedback item, it'll add the ID automatically for us. So we're not going to have to use that UUID module anymore like we've been doing. Because when you have a real API, that's what usually happens is you submit your data, but you don't actually send the ID or create that yourself. That gets added when you add it to the database if you're using MongoDB or whatever it might be. So let's go ahead and save that. Now we should be able to run our server if we do npm run server. Okay, so you can see it's watching on localhost 5000. Now you can use the browser to make a GET request, but I'm going to be using a tool called Postman. I believe you can get it at getpostman.com. So I'm going to go ahead and open that up. And we just close that up. That's from an old tutorial. So I'm going to make a GET request here to HTTP localhost. Whoops, what's this? No, I don't want to update right now. Let's say localhost. And it's port 5000, and then it's going to be / whatever your collection or schema is. In our case, it's feedback. So let's go ahead and send that. And now what you'll see we get back is, first of all, we get a status of 200, which means that's a good response. Everything's okay. And then you'll see the data that we get back is the data from that DB JSON file. Now I should be able to add some feedback here. I'm going to open up a new tab, and this time I'm going to make a post request. Okay, post is used to add data. I'm going to use the same endpoint, same URL, and then let's add for a body. We're going to choose this form URL encoded, and then let's add down here for a key. We'll say rating, and we'll do a rating of 9. And we also want to add text, and we'll say I don't know. We'll just say new feedback item. And then we'll send that, and we should get back a 201, which means okay, and it means something was created. And it even sends back the data that was created, and you can see that it adds the ID. So we have an ID of 4 because the last one that we had in the database or in our DB JSON was 3. We had ID 1, 2, 3, and now you can see right in the file it actually updated the file. So just really cool how this works. Now if we want to delete, for example, we can make a delete request. So let's go over here and say delete, and that's going to take in this URL, but we want to do / and then the ID we want to delete. Let's do 4, and we should be able to run that, and we get back a 200 response, okay, and we get an empty object. And you can see down here in the console it actually shows us the exact routes that we've been hitting. So feedback 4 should be deleted. If I go back to this tab and I make the GET request, you'll see that it's gone. And if I open up the DB JSON file, it should be gone as well. So we have a full CRUD API. We can even do filtering and sorting and all that. So it's a great mock backend that we can work with now to see how we can actually fetch data from the server and make post requests and deletes and all that from our React application. Okay, so before we jump back into our code, I want to make it so that we can have one single command to run both our back end and our front end, because right now we have to open up 2 terminals and run npm run start to run our React app, and then npm run server to run our JSON server on port 5000. So we can use this package called Concurrently to basically run multiple scripts with one command. And we can do that by creating a script in the package.json and then just running concurrently and then whatever 2 commands we want to run. And we just have to surround them in double quotes and escape them with the / here. So let's go ahead and jump back in. I'm going to stop the JSON server and let's do npm install concurrently. Okay, and then once that's done, we can go ahead and let's open up our package.json. And if we go down to scripts, we have our start script, which runs our React dev server, and then we have the server, which runs JSON-Server. So I'm actually going to create a new script. Let's put a comma here, and then we're going to have a script called dev. And for dev, let's go ahead and we're going to run concurrently. And then within these quotes here, we have to have a double quote that we escape. So we're going to do backslash and then a double quote, and then npm run server, and then we want to have another backslash and then double quote. So that's the first command that's going to run the JSON server. Then we want to have another escaped quote, so backslash double quote, and then npm start, which is going to run the React server. So then backslash double quote. Okay, so I know that this can look a little weird, but just make sure you do it exactly as I did here. So now let's save that. And we should now be able to do npm run dev, and you can see it's running 5,000. It's running the back end, and then it's going to proceed to run npm start, which is going to run our front end. Okay, they're not connected. This data is not coming from our back end yet. We're going to proceed to do that, but at least we have both running. In fact, if I open up a new tab here and I go to localhost 5,000, actually it's 5,000/feedback. We're going to see our JSON data. Okay, so both are running. So in the next video, we're going to proceed to replace this dummy data with the data from our backend. All right, so we have our data in our backend being served on localhost 5,000. In fact, if I go to that in my browser, that's going to be localhost 5,000/feedback. That's the endpoint that we want to hit to get our data, and that's the data we want to display here. So what we're going to do is go into our context file, and instead of just hard coding an array like we're doing here, we need to fetch that data and put it into this feedback. So let's first of all, let's clear this array out, this hard coded array. We still want to have an array, it's just going to be empty. That's the default, an empty array. And then we're going to need to bring in useEffect because we want to run this as soon as the page loads or as soon as our context loads. So underneath the state here, let's call useEffect, which takes in a function, and it also takes in an argument of dependencies or an array of dependencies, which in our case is just going to be empty because we only want this to run once, and that's when it loads. So in here, let's just do a console log for now, and you should see the feedback is going to clear up because we deleted the hard-coded reviews or hard-coded items. And then if you look at your console, you should see the 1, 2, 3 or whatever you logged. Now we need a function to fetch our data. So let's go under the useEffect and let's say fetch feedback, and let's say const fetch feedback, and we're going to be using async await. So I'm going to mark this as an asynchronous function. And then let's create a variable for our response. Now we're using the fetch API, which returns a promise. So we're going to say await fetch, and we want to hit the endpoint, which is HTTP localhost. Whoops, I forgot my quotes. Well, yeah, we'll just use backticks. You can use quotes too. There's no variables in here. But let's do localhost port 5000 / and then feedback. So that'll give us the data, but we can also sort it if we want. Using the JSON server gives us this capability by just adding on some query params. So I'll do !_sort, and let's set that to the ID. We'll sort it by the ID. And we want the order, so _order, we're going to set that to DESC, descending. Now, if you're familiar with the fetch API, which you really should be if you're learning React, we can then get the data from, we want to await on the response, and we want to get the JSON data, and we can do that with .json. So let's console log data, and we need to run this, and we want to run it when the page loads. So in the useEffect, let's call fetch feedback. So now you should see down here your 3 items, or whatever items you have in your db.json. That's what's being fetched on localhost 5000, or I should say being served on localhost 5000. Now, instead of just logging, let's go ahead and set the data, or set feedback. Set feedback. I don't know why I can't spell today. And now we should see that feedback on the screen. Now, it's a good idea when you're fetching from any kind of API or your own backend to have some kind of loading flag in the state, especially if you want to show like a spinner, which is what I'm going to do. So up here where we define our state, let's create something called isLoading. Okay, so we have a piece of state called isLoading, and then we'll have set isLoading. Set that to use state, which is going to be a Boolean. Now what I like to do is set it to true by default. So it's set to true, it's loading until we make the request, and then we set it to false. Now you can set this to false, and then you can set it to true and then back to false, but I like to just set it as true by default, but it's really up to you. And then what we want to do is go into our fetch feedback, and right after we set feedback, we're going to then set isLoading to false. Okay, now this isLoading value here, we can use that in any component that we want by coming down here and just passing it into the value. So we'll pass in isLoading. And then in the next video, what we'll do is we'll get this isLoading in the feedback list component, and we'll show a spinner for when it's actually loading. Okay, so now that we're fetching our data and we're passing that isLoading value down to any component that needs it, I want to show a spinner when the items are actually loading. So in components, I'm going to create a folder here called assets. And then I'm going to bring over my spinner, which is just a GIF file. And you can get this from the repository, or you can use your own. And I want this to show in the feedback list. So I'm going to open that up. Okay, so in feedback lists, we'll create the spinner component in a second, but let's just get this taken care of. So we're already bringing in the feedback from our context. So in addition to that, let's bring in isLoading. And then we have this check here where we're checking to see if there's no feedback or feedback length equals 0. We also want to make sure that isLoading is not true when we do this check. So let's say not isLoading, and then we want to wrap these two, this or, in parentheses. Okay, so we're saying if it's not loading and there's no feedback, or the length is 0, then we want to show no feedback. And then down here we want to check to see if it's loading. If it is, then we'll show the spinner. If not, then we'll show the rest of this. So to make this a little easier, let's do return. I'll delete the return below after, but here let's say return and then isLoading. And then if it is, then for now, actually we don't need quotes there. For now, let's just have an H3 and say loading. And then we want to do an else. And then whatever we want here, which is going to be this div. So I'm going to go ahead and cut that, and then we can get rid of that return. And then we can paste that in here, and we can save. All right, so now you can see it flash real quick there. See how it says loading? What you could do if you really want to test it, and if you want to slow things down, you could go to network, and you could go to, actually let's just make this bigger. Oh, I already have it. I have it on slow 3G. Make sure that if you do change this from no throttling to slow 3G, you put it back. Yeah, so I guess that's why it was showing. If I put on no throttling, well, you can still see it flash. But yeah, if you do want to slow it down, you can always change it to fast 3G, slow 3G, and so on. All right, so we know that loading is showing. Now I want that to be a spinner, this spinner.gif. So let's create another component, and this is going to go in shared. So let's go shared, and then let's create spinner.jsx. And then let's create a React component. and we want to bring in that image. So let's go up here and let's import. Let's see, we want to go dot dot slash, that's outside of shared, and then into what, assets, and then what did I call it? Yeah, spinner with a lowercase, spinner.gif. All right, so we want to bring that in, and then let's return an image. Actually, I'm going to just get rid of all this, and let's return an image tag. And this is going to take in source, which is going to be our spinner. I'm sorry, we need to import this as, say, import spinner, or from, I should say. Okay, so we're setting that as the source, and for the alt, we'll just put in loading, dot, dot, dot. And then I also want to add a little bit of style to put it in the middle. So let's say style, and then we want double curly braces. And let's add a width. So width, we're going to do 100 pixels. Let's do margin, set that to auto because we want it to be in the middle. And let's display as block so that the margin actually works. And that should do it. So now let's go into feedback list and let's bring in our spinner component. So that's going to be, let's see, that's going to be dot slash assets. No, I'm sorry, we want the component, which is going to be in shared. So shared and then spinner. Okay. So now we can go down here and let's just replace this H3 with our spinner component. So now we save, you can see really quickly the spinner flashes. All right, so we can close that up, close that up. Now what we need to do is work with the other functions we have, like the delete and the add, because right now I can delete from the UI, but it doesn't make any calls to the server, so when I reload, they come back. All right, so let's work on that next. Okay, so now we want to make the rest of our requests, because if we come down, the add feedback, the delete, the update, right now it's only working with the UI, right? If I were to add a piece of feedback here, it gets added to the UI, but if I reload, it goes away because it's not getting saved. We're not making any kind of fetch request to our JSON server. So we're going to get to that, but I first want to show you how we can add a proxy with React. What I mean is this localhost 5000, I don't want to have to put that into every request. I want to just do slash feedback and then whatever. So the way that we can do that is go to our package.json and we can add in proxy, and we're going to set that to HTTP localhost, I can't talk and type at the same time, localhost port 5000. And basically what it'll do is it'll use this as our proxy for every request that we make. Now once you deploy, if you have a custom backend or whatever on a specific domain, you would replace this. And that's better than going in and replacing this in, you know, all of your requests. So now we should be able to just do slash feedback like that. All right, and I believe you do have to restart the server, or maybe not, but I'm just going to anyways. Okay, and that should still work. Yep. All right, yep, so we're still getting the data. Good. So now we don't have to actually put HTTP localhost 5000 in our requests. So let's go down to the add feedback now. And basically, we're still going to set feedback because that takes care of the UI, but we want to make our request to the back end. So let's go right here and let's say const response, and we want to await fetch. Now since we're using await because we're waiting on a promise, we need to make this async. Okay, and then in here we should only need to do slash feedback. We don't need the local host, and we want this to be a post request, so we have to add some additional things here. So as a second argument, we're going to add an object, and let's say the method that we want this to be is a post request, just like we did from Postman earlier. And we want to set headers, and headers is going to be an object, and we just want to set the content type. Content dash type, and we want to set that to the type of application slash JSON, because that's what we're sending is JSON. And then we want, for the body, we're going to send new feedback, okay, which is coming in through this that we did this earlier. Now we're not going to have to assign an ID manually with UUID anymore, because the way JSON-Server works is just like most databases or most backends. It creates the ID automatically, so we can get rid of that. Now for the response, for the data, I should say, that will get the response. Then we want to get the data, so we want to await response.json. So that will give us the new feedback, the new item that we added. And then when we set the feedback, we're setting it to an array. We're spreading across the feedback that's already there. Now, instead of just using new feedback, I want to make sure we fill it with the data that's sent back from the back end. So we just need to replace that with data. All right, and that should do it. We don't need to bring in this UUID anymore. We don't even need it installed. Okay, so that should add it. Let's save. And it's still gonna, wait a minute, what's this? Unexpected. Oh, what did I do here? This should be body, and we want to set that to new feedback. And let's just wrap this in JSON.stringify, which will just turn it to a JSON string. Okay, so now let's try this. We'll say this is a test, and we'll do 5 send, so it gets added to the UI, the stats is updated, all that, but let's reload and it's still there. Okay, so it's been added to our, it should get added to the db.json. So if we look at that, you can see that that was added, and it added the ID of 4 too, because it's just auto increments. So again, JSON-Server is a really cool tool, and I'm not sponsored by them in any way or anything like that. But yeah, so now we can add. So in the next video, let's do our delete, because right now I can delete from the UI, but it's not actually deleting from the database. So we'll do the delete and we'll do the update in the next video. All right, so now let's finish up the requests that we need to make. So we have this delete feedback here where we're just deleting it from the UI, but let's go right above the set feedback. And we don't actually need to put the response into a variable. We just want to make a simple delete request. So I'm just going to await a fetch request, and of course we have to add async up here. So then inside fetch, we want to put some backticks, and the endpoint is going to be feedback slash and then the ID, and the ID is getting passed in here. And we just want to make sure that this is a delete request, so we're going to add here an object with method delete. Okay, and that should do it. We don't need to really do anything else here. So let's go ahead and try this out. So this one right here, this is a test. I'm going to delete, gets deleted from the UI. And you can see down here, if you have JSON-Server running, it'll show the endpoint. It shows you the 200 response. So if I reload, that should stay gone. So now we want to do the update. So let's go down to our update. Let's make this async since we're going to be using fetch. And let's go above the set feedback and say const response. And we want to await a fetch request. Let's put some backticks in here. And this is going to be slash feedback slash and then the ID. And it's going to be a put request. So let's put our brackets, our curly braces in here, and let's set the method to put because this is an update. And then we also want to set our headers since we're sending JSON data. So let's set headers to an object, and let's set the content dash type. We want to set that to application slash JSON. And then we want to send the body, that's going to go outside of headers. All right, so right here we want to set body, and we're going to set that to JSON.stringify and pass in the updated item. Okay, and that's coming from up here. Same thing, we did this earlier. And then let's get the data, so const data, and set that to await. And then we want the response.json. And then down here, when we're setting our feedback, instead of setting it this UPD item, which is what is sent in here, let's send it to the response we get back. So basically, we update on the server, we get that response back, which is the updated item, and then we'll put it here. So instead of UPD item, we'll change that to data, which is coming from the server. So now let's try it out. We'll go ahead and let's just add a new one. We'll say this is a new item. We'll do 9. Okay, and now I'm going to hit on the edit. That puts it in the form here. Let's change it to 8, and we'll change the text to this is an updated item, and send, and you can see that gets updated. So it's updated in the UI. Now let's reload just to make sure, and you can see that it did stick. So the actual data on the server also updated. All right, so that's pretty much it. That's going to be it for the front end of this. Now I might decide to build the back end out, because right now we're just using JSON-Server, which is a mock backend. That doesn't really have anything to do with React, but I might just do it for fun and add it on either in the next section, or I might add it towards the end of the course, or I might just do it in a YouTube video. I'm really not sure yet. But as far as the front end for this application, I think that we've gone over quite a bit, obviously all the fundamentals, components, props, state, how to pass props, events, context, working with a backend. So we've done quite a bit here, and I hope you enjoyed this project.